The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, this is Tamara Herman here at the CWC, and we're just going to wait a moment or two before we get started. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Sure. Hey, thanks everyone. This is John Keenan. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to start the webinar. So I'm John Keenan. I'm Corporate Governance Analyst with the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. And I'm also the chair of the Shareholder Activism Working Group for the Committee on Workers' Capital. I would like to go over just a few housekeeping items on the webinar first. After the presentations are complete, we will open the floor to questions for the webinar. And as we go along, you can type your question in the control panel on the right hand of your screen. And at the end of the session, I will read submitted questions for our panelists to answer. And also, please specify whether you want to ask a question to a specific panelist. The last 5 minutes of the webinar will be set aside for questions for people on phones who are not at computers, so we'll open up the phone lines. So we have a scheduled 1 hour for the webinar. The presentations will run for approximately 35 minutes, and the remaining time will be set aside for Q&A. So we'll be recording the webinar, and we'll have the video and recording available to share with attendees and others afterwards. So today's webinar will provide investors with critical information about the poor environmental and social record at a company called XPO Logistics, and present the case for XPO shareholders to support a shareholder proposal at the company's upcoming annual meeting on May 10th. Our presenters today will explain the rationale behind the shareholder proposal, highlight some of the key labor and workers' human rights concerns, and discuss why the issues we raise are of concern to investors. Before we move on to the proposals, I'd like to say a quick few words about the Committee on Workers' Capital, or the CWC. The CWC is an international labor union network for dialogue and action on the responsible investment of workers' capital. Workers' capital refers to workers' retirement and savings and pension funds, of which an estimated 38 trillion US dollars is invested in global capital markets. 38 trillion US dollars. So with over 200 participants in 35 countries, the CWC is meant to be an interface between the trustees of these pension funds and trade unions. We work to address environmental, social, and governance issues, ESG issues, that are important in terms of generating long-term sustainable return for pension funds and are also important for the labor movement. Every year, we select a select number of key shareholder resolutions that we feel are important to support. And this year, we are supporting a shareholder resolution at XPO Logistics because we'd like to improve its record on workplace practices and labor standards, which are accompanied by a set of legal, financial, operational, and reputational risks that are important for investors. So with that introduction underway, we're going to get to the presentation and the Teamsters. Our first presenters today are Louis Malizia, Assistant Director of the Teamsters Capital Strategies Department, and Michael Price-Jones, the Senior Corporate Governance Analyst. Louis and Michael will give us an overview of XPO and discuss their shareholder proposal calling for sustainability report at XPO Logistics. And with that, Louis and Michael.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the CWC for hosting this call. I think it's a great opportunity for us to get together and talk about a company that has pretty much gone under the radar, but it's had a meteoric rise in its capitalization and its impact on the globe. The Teamsters in our shareholder proposal are calling on XPO Logistics to disclose its sustainability policies and practices. While much of the focus on sustainability reporting has been on the company's exposure to climate risk, we believe XPO stakeholders are being left in the dark about the company's human capital management risks and challenges. We are happy to discuss climate concerns at XPO, but for this webinar, we're going to be focusing our presentation on the serious labor challenges facing XPO that threaten the company's long-term value.
So XPO basically makes global supply chains happen. So in your investment process or your proxy voting guidelines, you look at the ESG performance of major global corporations. You've really got to be focused on what's happening behind the scenes, and that's where XPO really comes into play. It's a transport and logistics company that's really had a meteoric rise over the last 5 years. It's gone from what would be an equivalent to a travel agent to a legacy airline company with physical assets with 89,000 employees and 46,000 trucks. So really it makes it makes global supply chains happen for major corporations.
And as you can see here, this is a total logistics company, and it's global in focus. It manages and organizes goods in nearly every way imaginable. One can think of it as a transport brokerage that also operates and employs its human and physical capital. It's in warehousing, it's in trucking, it's in intermodal movement of goods from ports to the rail yards, and finally, it's bringing goods like appliances right to your house in its last mile division.
XPO is a global company with major facilities and operations both in the US and in Europe, but also you see that it moves supply chains across the world here with facilities in Asia and in South America as well.
And here you can see, if you don't know who XPO is, you probably know who their clientele is, who they're moving these goods and services for. And you know, you might not know XPO, but you know Honda, you know Dole, you know IKEA, you know Samsung, you know the U.S. Post Office.
One of the most interesting aspects of XPO is its explosive growth over the last 5 years. It's really gone from a paper-pushing company to one with extensive facilities, extensive human capital investments, and substantial physical assets. It's grown largely by acquisitions, and in any largely acquisition-led growth strategy, you've got to be concerned about how it's changing its business model and how it's measuring those impacts on its bottom line here. So you can see that it's gone from 216 employees just 5 years ago to over 87,000 today, and you can see its physical asset growth has grown from pretty much something nominal 57 million to nearly $12 billion in assets.
And this slide, what it doesn't show is the tens of thousands it employs on contract basis or as independent owner-operators and other contractors, which is a very important topic that we'll be discussing today.
Go ahead, Liz. XPO has really found itself in the headlines for its human capital management. It's been accused of violating freedom of association. It's been accused of sweatshop conditions. It has the kind of Uber-like business model which is now being challenged. If you just pick up the Wall Street Journal, the challenges to the independent contractor model, which is at the heart of the gig economy, is really playing out in tremendous way at XPO Logistics as well. And so it's in the headlines of the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, and many other companies at the same, and many other outlets as well. One of the things that's really concerning here is we're facing a huge human capital management shortage in the logistics industry right now, and there's a big question of who is to blame here and whether it's the business model which relies heavily upon using independent contractors as their primary source of employees.
So the company's policies and practices give way to greater exposure of the risks related to the major driver shortages in North America. You'll now hear from Jose Herrera, an XPO port driver based at the Port of Los Angeles, who will describe for you the conditions he and other port drivers face from XPO's policy of misclassifying them as non-employees. This is the story of a company that serially exploits its workers and places them in precarious working conditions. Then you'll hear from Becky Smith, the Deputy Director of the National Employment Law Project, who will speak to the systemic problems of misclassification and that it is a system that is under attack from the legal and regulatory front. Then Ray Walker, a 24-year XPO driver from King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, will share how he and his coworkers faced a bitter attack on their freedom of association rights when they sought to form a union with the Teamsters. This is an attack that has been repeated each and every time an XPO work group has sought union representation. Jose?
Good morning. Good morning, and thank you for allowing me to join this call today. I drive a truck for XPO Cottage, holding cargo for XPO customers like Walmart, Target, and Costco, serving the Port of LA and nearby rail yards. I'm originally from El Salvador, and I have been in the USA for the last 38 years. XPO controls every aspect of my work. They have the customer relationships, not me. They tell me where to go and when to go there. The truck I drive has an XPO clearly marked on the outside. I'm not allowed to take the truck to any other company if work is slow at XPO. And even though they are clearly in control of my work, they refuse to give me the same rights as the employee drivers. That means that I have no workers' compensation if I get injured on the job. That means that I have no disability insurance if something was to happen to me. I have nothing. That's not all. They deduct their business expenses from our paychecks. They charge us to drive for the XPO truck. They charge us to maintain the XPO truck. They charge us to repair the XPO truck. They charge us for everything. I always known that this is illegal, and that's why my coworkers and I have been fighting, suing, and striking, and we won't quit. Over the weekend, I found out that the California Labor Commissioner ruled that XPO misclassified me and 3 other drivers as independent contractors. The Labor Commissioner issued an order that XPO owes me alone $279,415.83 for stealing my wages. The total awarded for me and the other 3 drivers is $855,285.62, and more cases are pending in courts. Although such rulings have been issued repeatedly for poor drivers, ours is the first set of cases where the Labor Commissioner has included unpaid wages for what they call non-productive time. Time is spent inspecting the truck, waiting for dispatch, or scanning in paperwork at the end of the day. As shareholders in this company, you need to know that XPO is breaking the law by exploiting its workforce. Not only is wrong, but it's illegal. As you can see, very expensive. Thank you for your time today.
And now you'll hear from Becky Smith, the Deputy Director of the National Employment Law Project. Becky?
Thanks very much. Can folks hear me? Can you
Loud
hear
and
me?
clear, Becky.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for having me. You know, port trucker misclassification is kind of a case study in one of the biggest challenges that's facing our economy and the workers who literally keep it running, and that's really the struggle for decent pay in return for their work. And port trucker misclassification fits within this larger trend of corporations shifting risk and responsibility onto workers like Jose by calling them independent contractors or franchisees, or offloading responsibility onto a third party like a staffing agency or a subcontractor. It's really no secret why companies do this and how it's related to fair pay. Depending on the industry and the law in the particular place and the kinds of business expenses that workers are shouldering, companies can save up to 30% of their payroll costs by mischaracterizing their workers as entrepreneurs who are in business for themselves. So that's a huge advantage for companies and a huge disadvantage to workers like Jose Herrera, like he's explained. When they are caught, though, that 30% savings means the consequences are huge as well, and many have been caught in recent years because the counter trend is a new focus in the U.S. Department of Labor, at the National Labor Relations Board, and with state labor agencies, as well as private litigants on this issue of misclassification. And it's very evident in the case of port trucking, where agencies and courts at many levels have found that the workers are employees. So of course that includes the California Department of Labor Standards Enforcement, which last I heard had about 700 claims filed by drayage drivers. And their last public statement is that they've awarded over $35 million, an average of about $100,000 per worker, to something around 300 drivers. But it's not just the DLSE. The US DOL has made these findings. The IRS has done so in one case, and state agencies in Washington and New Jersey, as of the date of a report I co-authored in 2014, have also found these drivers to be employees, not independent contractors. So at the time of our report, we tried to calculate the losses for the industry as a whole due to misclassification. And we calculated 16,000 misclassified drivers in California, and what we thought was about a conservative estimate of about 4,000 a month per worker per claim. And so we found total liability in California of between about 787 million and 998 million yearly. And that isn't counting underpayments to state and federal tax collectors, which we calculated at about 60 million nationally. So at that time, there were about 500 claims filed at DLSE, and that was the basis of our calculation, and about a dozen lawsuits in the industry. And now there are many more than that just against XPO and its subsidiaries. Apart from the case that Jose is talking about, his case, DLSE awarded $2.9 million to 7 drivers and another $900,000 to another 5 drivers. So that's an average award of over $300,000 per worker. Those cases are on appeal. If you assume that XPO and its subsidiaries have about 500 workers, I'll say employees, that liability increases exponentially, even if it's 100,000 per worker, if all of them file claims. So how do the losses mount so high? First, there's unpaid time, and Jose just talked about that. In his case, the DLSE found that workers were spending about 5 hours per day waiting for dispatch, waiting at client sites, doing daily paperwork, and other unpaid time. Frequently, the drivers are owed overtime pay at time and a half. Meal and rest breaks have almost never been paid for these workers. And under California law, business expenses like fuel and licenses and leases and insurance have to be paid if you're an employer. So that's not counting penalties and attorney's fees. And finally, there are the consequences of 2 pending claims before the National Labor Relations Board, saying that XPO companies have committed unfair labor practices by calling their workers independent contractors. And that characterization has served to deny the workers protection under the National Labor Relations Act. So liability is huge. It's no wonder that we have also seen a number of bankruptcies as a result of workers enforcing their rights. There are at least 3 that I'm aware of, and likely more. And the liability should be huge. You're investors, so you can think of this as costs to the company, which are huge and possibly bankruptcy inducing. But I want you to think as well about the impact of shouldering these costs year in, year out for all of these workers. And we've just heard about that from Jose Herrera, who is owed close to $300,000 himself. So every agency that has looked at port trucking, and at XPO companies specifically, has come to the same conclusion. These workers who are told, as Jose says, by the company what to do, when and how to do it, where to do it, and for how much money, are not entrepreneurs. They're the employees of the companies. Thank you.
Thank you for that very informative look at the perils of misclassification, Becky. And now to kind of so the other side of the coin at XPO is how they treat the actual workers that they're classifying as employees. And the record over in the past few years has been very dismal when it comes to upholding workers' rights to freedom of association and assembly. And to talk about that, we have an XPO freight driver, Ray Walker, who came to XPO through its transformative purchase of Conway Freight in the United States in 2015. It was part of two large acquisitions in its kind of vertical M&A activity that's grown the company to where it is that year. One was at Conway, and the other was the large European transporter Norbert d'Entresangle. So, Ray, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Louis. I appreciate it, giving me this opportunity. I'd like to thank the Committee for Workers' Capital also for inviting me to participate on this webinar for the XPO shareholders. As Louis said, my name is Ray Walker. I was employed, or I am employed actually, for 24 years with Conway Freight, which is now XPO. They bought us in 2015. I work out of the King of Prussia, Pennsylvania terminal. That's right outside of Philadelphia for those who aren't familiar with the area. In September 2016, my fellow workers and I decided to seek union representation. We had grown tired of deteriorating work benefits and pay that was growing worse since the XPO acquired us. We were looking to put an end to the increase of associated medical insurance and the downgrading coverage. We also needed to ensure we could secure a future with a viable retirement package. As a nation, we face a driver shortage. As employees, we believe we must stop this downward slide and protect the future value of the company. Without fair pay and benefits, it is extremely difficult to attract safe, experienced, skilled drivers. I and my fellow workers filed for a petition for a union vote in October 2016. The weeks that led up to our vote on November 10th were very stressful, to say the least. We were subjected to 3 weeks of union busting tactics brought on by XPO, which tested our resolve as a cohesive group to improve our terms of employment. The company hired an outside consulting firm by the name of American Consulting Group, who specialized in union busting. We were subjected to long, mandatory, captive audience meetings that went on for hours for 3 weeks. One-on-one meetings with management and union busters were held. Along the way, the company violated workers' rights throughout the entire process. Drivers were singled out for a full-day ride-along with anti-union persuaders in their trucks. The company set out to pit driver against driver and longtime friends against each other to manipulate the outcome. They also distributed a lot of anti-union literature during the campaign. It was nonstop for 3 weeks straight. The company vowed during this entire process that they would correct many of the problems that we had at a local level if we just voted no. We were visited by all the top company brass, all of them stating that if we voted no, they would make our situation better. Since we voted in the union, the company has not followed through with any of those promises to make things better. We have been completely abandoned by the company brass. The companies also retaliated by eliminating our most profitable line haul runs, having a direct economic effect on all the employees. XPO terminated some drivers without just cause or prior warning, and they removed a progressive disciplinary system that we had in place and put in a one strike, you're out policy. Managers threatened to withhold a promised bonus for all the employees at our location, only to produce it when faced when we finally threatened unfair labor practice. XPO also withheld annual pay increases for our location, making it clear to surrounding terminals that we are not getting it because we voted the union in. For our loyal hard work, which has helped reap profits for the shareholders, what XPO workers want is a voice, dignity, and respect. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. And and this behavior has been repeated in basically every location that we know of where workers have tried to organize, whether it be with the Teamsters or other unions in the United States. The committing of unfair labor practices that not only fall short of ILO standards and the international law, they also fall short of compliance with U.S. law, but the company is banking on that. Just you commit in the United States these unfair labor practices, and often the penalty is a posting on that you won't do the same thing again. But when it comes to the next time a worker wants to organize, out come the anti-union consultants, out come the unfair labor practices, and the cycle repeats itself.
But that's great information, and thank you, Ray and Jose, for illustrating these examples that are going on here, and Louis and Michael and Becky. This is a lot of troubling information. To end our series of presentations, I'm going to switch it over. We have with us Shannon Rohan, who is the Director of Responsible Investment at SHARE. SHARE is a Canadian organization that provides responsible investment research, education, and services to institutional investors. And Shannon leads SHARE's efforts through the Valuing Decent Work project to mobilize investors to support decent work policies and practices in companies, invested companies, and more broadly in the capital markets. So, Shannon.
Thank you, John. It's really a pleasure to be a part of this webinar and this conversation today, and to discuss an issue that I think we're seeing that more and more shareholders are paying attention to, and that's really how companies are managing their, quote, greatest asset, as they often say, their workers. But the reality is that there are too many poor quality and precarious jobs around the world, and the experiences that we've heard this morning or today from Ray and Jose are common experiences, I think, increasingly common among workers worldwide. The ILO estimates that more than 60% of workers worldwide are in temporary, part-time, or short-term jobs where they see their wages falling. So this is a reality that we're faced with in the workforce. It's a grim reality for workers. It's a concern for labor. It's a concern for economists and for public policy. But what I want to talk about today is why it's a concern for investors. And there are really two principal concerns at work here for investors. One is the impacts that these practices have at a broad level on the economy, and the second is the impacts that it has on the firm. Very often as investors, we tend to focus on the firm and not as much at the portfolio level, but weak economies drag down performance across the board, and so as investors we really need to look at both levels. And so I'll start by looking at that sort of broad economy-wide level. The growth in precarious forms of employment is one factor fueling income inequality worldwide. And there is a growing body of research from institutions such as the IMF, the World Economic Forum, and the OECD, showing that growing inequality is harmful to long-term economic growth. A 2015 study found that inequality had shaved 4.7% off growth between 1990 and 2010 in OECD countries. And research conducted by the IMF found that unequal societies are more likely to experience shorter periods of sustained economic growth and more frequent recessions. So why does this greater inequality hamper growth? Higher inequality creates political, social, and economic instability. We know it has an impact on demand and reduces aggregate demand in the economy. Higher inequality can contribute to excessive borrowing, leading to credit bubbles like we saw in 2008. And also, as we've seen recently at the international level, inequality can also lead to political capture by elites. And so these are sort of some of the very macro level issues that are happening and that are very much relevant to investors and certainly something that we need to pay attention to. But what are the company level impacts? The practices that we have heard about today in this webinar regarding XPO Logistics should certainly raise flags for its shareholders in terms of the company's ability to manage risk and to generate long-term value. We've heard about many of the risks for the company, including the legal risks associated with pending class action lawsuits and some of the very real financial implications of those class actions as was described to us. We have heard of labor unrest as a result of the company's practices, including strikes in California and in France. And also the important reputational risks for the company emerging from the kinds of headlines it is getting. Its major customers such as Carrefour, UPS, and IKEA are particularly sensitive to these kinds of issues. And if it hasn't already, I'm sure that these headlines are going to start to raise some red flags for XPO's key clientele. And at the same time, as a transportation and logistics firm, XPO is heavily dependent on its workforce for successful execution from its warehouse to household delivery. However, the approach that the company is taking to managing its workforce may have implications in terms of its ability to execute efficiently. And as Ray just mentioned in his presentation, it also has implications for the company's ability to attract and retain the kinds of skilled and experienced drivers that it really needs and depends on. We know that companies with poor labor practices can experience problems also in terms of high turnover, lower productivity, and in this way human management policies and practices for companies can really be material to their financial performance, and there's a growing body of evidence supporting this link too. So there are clear reasons that XPO shareholders need to be paying attention to the company's practices and approaches in these areas. And the last point that I really want to make is that I think what is important to recognize in the case of XPO is that underlying its poor human capital management performance is really a failure of corporate governance and the need for the company to catch up to its own growth. It is no longer a paper-pushing company, as Michael said, I believe, with 216 employees. Its own website boasts that it's the largest logistics company in North America. It was named the fastest growing company on the Fortune 500 list. It states that it wants to be a world-class global company. But in order to really live up to that, XPO needs to demonstrate its commitment to basic principles of good corporate governance, and that includes transparency. As shareholders, we are well placed to make a difference. The first step is to make sure XPO is disclosing meaningful, comparable data on its environmental, social, and corporate governance performance, and including, as we've heard this morning, clearly we need more information on how it's managing its workforce. And so those are really all of the comments that I wanted to make, but certainly would encourage all of XPO shareholders to support this resolution.
Shannon, that's great. I want to remind everyone to please submit your questions in the dialogue box on the right, and we will get into a Q&A with the panel. And Shannon, your information on how inequality is bad for investors overall, so bad for our retirement plans, but then at the same time that the worker rights at our companies is a key factor in contributing to inequality. So it seems like these things are interrelated. So, but yeah, first question, I just, if the panelists and Louis and Michael and Shannon can just say a little bit about your shareholder proposal and what investors can do to support it.
Sure. Well, first thing, I just want to alert to everyone the annual meeting is going to be held on May 10th. Proxies very late in the game, went out only Monday, late on after 5 o'clock Monday this week, so didn't give a lot of folks time to digest the proxy, but I believe it is the only shareholder proposal on the ballot this year, and we're hoping for your support there. And as I think Shannon did an excellent job of tying together all the threads here. But we believe that XPO needs to affirmatively address its systemic human capital management problems. And the first and perhaps most crucial step is acknowledging these concerns to its shareholders through disclosure. An annual sustainability report gives stakeholders a more transparent picture of a company whose growth has been built on a most fragile foundation. And as Shannon already mentioned, it's an at-risk business model given its reliance to labor, and its practices and policies exacerbate, not mitigate these risks. And it already has been creating operational and reputational risks for its clients. It was at the heart. It operated the warehouse in the UK that nearly created the end of one of the largest fashion retailers globally, ASOS, this year. It created a parliamentary discovery panel, as well as investigation, tons of bad headline press. When they took over another warehouse that for the distribution of the main supermarket chain in the St. Louis, Missouri area, Schnucks, it was a total failure and has now caused the company to be booted from Schnucks, and they're in a war now of lawsuits that's saying we fired you, no, we quit type of situation, and it doesn't do well for XPO. So the sustainability risks in the rapid growth of the business, there needs to be much more reflection at the board level and communication with stakeholders. And with that, I think it's a perfect time to go to questions.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Louis. Our first question, and this can go to Jose, Becky, or Barb, or anyone else is free to go to it as well, but has XPO made any changes in their policies after the legal action from the state of California and as a result of the class action suits they're facing?
Nothing has changed, and we are not going to back down as investors. You must know that.
And yeah, and anyone else? So it sounds like they've dug their heels in and aren't making any changes.
Yes, I don't know of, this is Becky, I don't know of any changes either. I will say that that is often the result of enforcement action, including private settlements. And I think there is one port trucking company that has reclassified its workers, and then it's occurred in other industries as well after they've been found guilty of misclassification or even in a settlement without a finding.
Just a reminder to submit your questions on the right. So this sounds like, I mean, there's a lot of information about the lawsuits and the individual cases. Becky and anyone else, can you give a kind of an estimate of the financial risk to investors through the misclassifications and the legal liability the company is facing?
think that if we assume that there are 500 workers in California or with the company, and that all of them file claims, and that those claims are in the neighborhood of the decisions that have already been made, then I did calculate this, it's about 158 million in potential liability in the DLSE cases.
And this is Lewis, and that's about 10% of earnings at this company. So it's not insignificant, and and that really only touches regulatory enforcement. And there's growing groups of workers that are forming class action suits, not only in their port operations but also in their last mile operations. There was one that just at the start of the new year that was filed in the state of Florida for XPO workers. So this is because the company, as the original part of the question, have we seen their practices and policies change? Because it's not changing, the snowball only gets bigger.
And the liability risk is only half the story. The other half is what will be the business model going forward, and how will they be impacting their bottom line from having to pay workers more and addressing the tax issue.
And as Shannon put it, if you're looking at from a portfolio perspective, this is a company that touches, I'm sure, dozens of companies in investors' portfolios. And if you're caring about the supply chain and other human capital management and ESG issues, this is a company that you need to be looking at.
Yeah, that is a lot of risk, and yeah, thank you for quantifying that. Next question is, how would you compare XPO with a company like UPS, which has a predominantly labor union workforce?
Well, the first point on UPS is they actually disclose an awful lot of information on their sustainability. Obviously, climate change figures very strongly in that, but they also talk about human capital management, turnover rates, engagement of employees. They provide metrics. So it's not just that UPS is unionized, it's the fact that they actually provide a lot of disclosure which allows shareholders to gauge how they're managing what is a big shortage in the trucking industry and the logistics industry of human capital itself. And so you get a sense of how they're managing that and how they're reinforcing the culture as well as a culture of success and inclusion there. The union component of that is just an aspect of that.
And I think, but it's a legitimate one. If you from Ray's perspective, at least it gives the workers a chance to get in part of the dialogue about how to address issues to attract skilled and valued professionals into the transportation field at a time of such driver shortage.
Great. Our next question is: have you guys have the pension funds throughout the so Australia, Europe, everywhere that own XPO, has that been mapped out?
Well, I think it's always changing, especially given the size of this company kept changing from small cap to mid cap to large cap. So it's in many different portfolios, and we have been in touch with investors from the various funds. Webinars such as this is a great way to, and organizations such as the CWC is a great way to get in touch with the other funds who may have exposure, because often when we look at a shareholder list of the 13F holders, it's rarely the fund, it's normally the asset manager. So we have to rely on kind of organizations such as this to get to folks at the fund level, and also through our union contacts and other pension fund contacts. And it's also important to get in front of the asset managers and kind of continue their education on the importance of the S in the ES and G.
So it's really a two-step process: finding direct owners, but then finding the secondary connections. So that's going on. Our next question: ESG performance. How does XPO compare with its peers?
In terms of disclosure, it falls far short of its peers, which would include UPS, FedEx,
DHL. Yeah.
DHL. We've benchmarked all of those, and on both the climate change and the human capital management metrics, XPO falls far short. The only disclosure XPO provides is actually from the European company it actually bought back in 2015. It's tried to pass that off as a legitimate response to our proposal, but I think as most people on this call would appreciate, partial disclosure can be as misleading as full disclosure, and it's entirely unclear how those practices which they're adhering to in Europe translate across the enterprise. And it's also very strange that if you have bought a company where you've had full disclosure, you then decide that somehow shareholders at the aggregate level don't deserve the same level of disclosure and the same level of insight that you had when you purchased that company. And one of the biggest challenges we have is understanding what this company, which has grown fivefold over the last 5 years, actually looks like, and how does management even know what it looks like in its workforce.
So they have a ways to go, it sounds like. This next question is for the workers on the phone. Hopefully we have Jose and maybe Monica Abraham as well, and either also Ray. But have any union workers feel like they've been discriminated against for trying to join a union?
Yeah, a lot of retaliations, lost cut, forced to leave, forced to sign new contracts to waive our rights, multiple violations of labor laws filled with federal agencies. Hearings are scheduled this summer because of that.
This is Barb Maynard. I'm here with Jose. The federal agency that he is referring to is the National Labor Relations Board. Region 21 covers the Southern California area. And the drivers have filed multiple unfair labor practice charges with the NLRB for violations of their rights. And the interesting thing about these filings is that as independent contractors, they actually are not protected by the National Labor Relations Act. But in each one of these cases, the NLRB's region has ruled that they're misclassified as independent contractors and thus are protected under the NLRA and have gone ahead and scheduled hearings to hear their cases. There's just a tremendous amount of retaliation, discrimination against these workers for openly supporting the union, for filing wage and hour cases with the labor commissioner, and for going on strike. It's a really terrible and egregious situation here. Thank you.
And there have been, on their employee side, there have been terminations against for the jobs of union supporters, and this is a more recent activity. The company had kind of gone up to that line, but not crossing it, and it seems in the past couple weeks it has crossed that line, and charges are being filed bring justice for those workers who we believe have been wrongfully terminated. And that's just among other forms of retaliation. You heard there's been economic ones as well as profitable runs and denying company-wide raises, other such kind of payback for your union support.
Anyone else? A lot of issues. Yes.
Yeah, Ray, I'd just like to back up what Louis is just saying. We have filed numerous charges, and they're pretty substantial charges without going into detail. But just about what Louis had just said, the retaliation has been pretty much nonstop since we filed our petition, and they've held pay raises from our particular terminal, our location, and made a point in other locations to make sure that we were being withheld those pay raises because we voted the union in. So it's just numerous things, and like I said, that's all been charged with Region 7 in Philadelphia with the Labor Board.
So there's a consistent pattern of retaliation against workers for seeking to exercise their freedom of association. So that's thank you all for those responses.
John, I would add that this is we see the retaliation at the highest levels of the corporation. In Connecticut, where warehouse workers formed a union leading up to the vote there, the CEO and founder of the company, Bradley Jacobs, led anti-union meetings, which is very rare and strange occurrence for such a huge company. But he deemed to insert himself in these discussions. And as you heard from Ray before, they would have company management also ride along with the truck driver all day. If you can imagine that form of how intimidating that is, to have a manager sit beside you as you perform your task all day, looking for anything besides prodding you against supporting a union, but also possibly looking at anything that you may do that they can use against you during the course of a workday.
So that culture runs all the way up through management. We have one last question before we will open up the lines, and this is, so anyone who knows this one, how have companies that contract with XPO services responded to this issue? Have they responded at all? And what kind of outreach is being done there? So, open question.
Yeah, this is Mike here. The elephant in the room here is ASOS, which Lewis has already alluded to, is the biggest fashion e-commerce retailer in the United Kingdom. They had what was pretty much the 2016 version of Sports Direct, where their warehouse was investigated by BBC Panorama, BuzzFeed, and a number of other investigative news outlets, showcasing essentially Victorian-style workhouse conditions there. The facility was run by XPO. It created huge headline risk. It's been the subject of a parliamentary inquiry. What has happened is very interesting now, that the members of parliament toured the facility, and ASOS touted all the changes that they had made in their labor practices. And then XPO was asked, what have you done differently? And they simply said nothing. So in terms of the disconnect between what companies are saying who contract with XPO Logistics, what XPO is saying is a chasm there. And so it's really unclear. We know that companies are very concerned about the reputational and operational damage and disruption that can cause from XPO-run operations. But what XPO is doing differently and how they respond to that concern is entirely unclear. And then obviously, as Lewis has already alluded to, at Schnucks, all the guns have come out firing. We now have the two companies, Schnucks, which outsourced its operations to XPO and then brought them back because of the challenges XPO had in running those, has led to a huge number of lawsuits in either direction there. So companies are becoming concerned, but XPO doesn't seem to be responsive to those concerns.
That seems like, another critical factor in this equation is the people, the companies, and whether they use XPO, do they then condone those practices, and can they speak up to say, hey, don't do that. So that seems like a critical point to raise with XPO's clients. So this is great. We're basically going to open it up now to turn on all attendees' microphones at this point. And if you are able to, please turn your microphone in your phone to mute unless you'd like to speak, so that we don't have too much background noise. So with that, open questions. Please feel free to ask. Questions, comments, going once.
C'est aussi une liste de new listings. Oh man, look. Ça, c'était un trimestre avant. Anyways, if we need it, I can ask. Okay.
Hi everyone, this is Tamara from the CWC. I just want to thank you all for coming on the call. It doesn't look like we had any more questions on the phone line, so we're going to wrap up and we will be sending you a follow-up email with a link to listen to the webinar again, as well as with the presenter's contact info. So once again, on behalf of the CWC, we'd like to thank you all for listening in. And for those of you who are starting your days in North America, wishing you a really great day, and those of you ending your days in Europe, I hope you have a lovely evening. Thank you.